Hey guys, Into the End here. With the release of the new expansion, Horus Trevor, um, DWD has given us some new toys to play with, and you can tell that they are interested in supporting the Life Force mechanic by introducing a couple of very good Life Force cards. So I have spent the last few days working on a new updated version of the Life Force deck that I used to run. And here's the deck tech. But before we jump into the card selection and the deck itself, I do want to do something a little different and spend about 5 minutes theory crafting. And you can skip this part if you like, but I think the current state of Life Force mechanic and the decks have some serious problems to overcome. I personally believe that Life Force decks are not really quite there at Tier 1 yet. From a gameplay perspective, I think any time that you have a conditional mechanic that requires a precise combination of enablers and payoff cards, you are subjected to variance problems. First of all, you need to draw the right combination of cards, and you have to draw them in the right order. We all know that 75 card decks vastly increase draw-related variance compared to other games with much smaller deck sizes. Second, the enablers and the payoff cards need to be fairly decent individually to mitigate the impact of bad variance when you don't draw them in the right order. DWD has attempted to improve on this with these two new cards in the expansion, but I think it is still not quite there because these cards are good enablers, but we're still lacking some great payoff cards. And moving away from gameplay related issues, I also want to talk about some theoretical game design issues. If you look at Life Force, or specifically the enabler of Life Force, Life Gain, life is one of the fundamental resources in Eternal, just like power, the number of cards you draw, the number of turns you take. One can argue that life might be the most important resource because you lose the game when you run out of it. But is that really the case? The interesting thing about life, as compared to the other resource, is that as long as your life total is not 0, you don't actually benefit greatly from having an enormous amount of it. You suffer from diminishing returns. As far as the game is concerned, you're either at 0 life or not at 0 life. Killing your opponent while you have 1 life remaining will win you the game just as much as killing your opponent while you have 100 life. And this is the inherent problem with the Life Force mechanic. To enable it, you need to gain life. But once you gain that life, it is largely useless except for certain all-in early game strategies. Most mid-range and control decks aren't actively trying to attack your life total anyway. Instead, they're vying for board state dominance and late game inevitability. In which case, no amount of life you have will save you once they have achieved those goals. So having a huge, enormous amount of life doesn't help you. So let's quickly compare Life Force as a mechanic with something very similar, namely the Empower mechanic. Both abilities provide you with a benefit when a certain condition is met, namely the gaining of a specific resource. But the difference is, power is absolutely necessary to play the game, and every deck naturally gains power without any effort, without any additional effort. And power is a resource that you gain, and then you can use it up for great benefits. Life, on the other hand, is a resource that you can only gain with a lot of effort put into it that is not part of the natural course of gameplay. And once you've gained it, you get the one-time benefit of Life Force. You can't use it up for some great benefit. There are currently no cards in Eternal that allows you to pay a large amount of life for a great benefit. For Life Force decks to truly be competitive, I personally believe there needs to be a new category of cards that requires life as a payment as part of the cost. And I'm not talking about paying 1 life or 2 life for a small incremental gain. I'm talking about paying a large amount of life for a large gain, so that these cards can't be jammed into normal non-life gain devoted decks. So with that ramble aside, and I apologize if you're not interested in theory crafting, let's jump into making a Life Force deck. So how do we approach deck design if you want to make a competitive Life Force deck? So for me, I have set myself 3 conditions when I make this deck. Number 1, the life gain cards, the enablers that I use, must provide incidental life gain that is passive, and ideally repetitive, and that they should be good even when there are no Life Force enablers. Sorry, no Life Force payoff cards. Second, the Life Force card, the payoff card, must be very powerful to justify the times where you fail to gain life and trigger it. So, in a sense, high risk, high reward. And number 3, the deck should have some ways to go over the top, or at least be competitive with mid-range and late-game decks. So it needs to be able to do something degenerate if the game is gone on long enough. And the reason why I specifically target mid-range and late-game decks is because Life Force decks, by the virtue of its existence, is already kind of anti-aggro, because they're trying to attack your life total and you're just passively gaining a lot of life. So let's take a look at this deck. I've only shown you 62 cards from the deck, and this is what I would consider to be core. The other 13 slots is flexible. So Sanctuary Priest, this card is very weak in most decks, but in this one I think it serves enough purposes to earn itself 4 slots. Against aggressive decks, blocking a turn 1 Power Knight or Ronin is perfectly acceptable, even if you gain no life from the Empower trigger. And very often your opponent will waste a torch on it on turn 1 or turn 2, which is very good for you. The more units that you play that demand an immediate removal from your opponent, the more likely it is that your other later, more important units will stick around. The passive life gain is also very useful for triggering Life Force later on in the game. With all that said, though, the Priest, is it an amazing card? No, it's not. But is it the best we got out of a very limited pool of choices in the early game, particularly in the 1 casting cost slot? Yes, this is one of the best options that we have, unfortunately. Okay. Next card we want to talk about is Temple Scribe. This is the perfect card for this deck. It replaces itself upon summon. It leaves behind a body for Katra to buff later on. It chump blocks early against aggro or trades, and it gains you a life which triggers Life Force. This is one of the key enablers for the entire deck, and a must-have. Vara's Favor. This is another key enabler of the deck. It acts as a removal card against early game aggressive decks, and it gives you the much needed shadow influence, because this deck does have some pretty heavy early game requirements on both time and in shadow. In today's meta, it's also actually a very good way to kill Auric Rune Hammers. The 1 damage is quite relevant, and it's also very effective at triggering the Aegis or opposing Aegis units like Bartholo. The split of Seek Power and Amber Acolyte, you can do 4 of one, 0 of another, or all 8. The number here is entirely up to you to adjust, depending on what you want your curve to look like, whether or not you want the body, and how many bigger late game cards you add to your 13 flex slots. Ayan is, in my honest opinion, pretty mediocre until you hit 9 power. This is why in the core of the deck there's only 2 copies. I know that some people love this card, but I've never found it to be super impressive myself. A majority of the games that I play him, he just kind of sits there because he's too small to attack into your opponent's board, and he's also too small to really block your opponent's aggressive threats. At best, he's double blocking something at the risk of getting torched and blown out in combat. At the very, very best, he ambushes an unsuspecting attacker if your opponent is not playing around it. But more realistically, I think his best use is just simply trade against an aggressive deck and gain a little bit of life. Trading a unit, gain some life, buy yourself some time. Once again, that's why there's 2 copies. In your flex spots later on, if you plan to fight a very aggressive meta, then you can go up to 4 copies. Okay. This card is fantastic. This card is actually what Ayan fails to be in a Life Force deck. This is an evasive 3 attack threat, which will get lifesteal most of the time in this deck. 3 damage is quite significant, and its repeatable life gain every turn makes this absolutely perfect for a Life Force deck. For many aggressive and mid-range decks, this card is a must answer for them, or they're going to lose the race against you. And especially against burn-related decks, hitting with this Valkyrie a few times gains you 3 hits is 9 life. That's an enormous chunk of life. It makes racing impossible. Once again, similar to what I've said before, the more of these sort of must-answer threats that you have, the more likely it is that your later, even stronger units are going to survive, because your opponent will run out of removal. Okay. The Devoted Theurge, another critical component to the deck, and an absolute gift from DWD from the new set. It is really the combination of Sadistic Valkyrie and Devoted Theurge that I think this deck can potentially become competitive if someone fine-tunes it enough. This card is everything a Life Force needs. It's a sizable body. 4 mana for 4/4 is perfectly fine, not great. But it does have the ability to grow. It gives you incidental life gain upon summon, which is a huge plus. And then the repeatable life gain for triggering Life Force later on in the game makes this a fantastic top deck, even late in the game when you have abundance of resources. And the fact that it grows also makes this a must-answer threat. This card, I think, is probably the most important card in this whole deck right now. It's the most important enabler, in this deck. In this deck, it is better than Sandstorm Titan. And as you can see, there is no Sandstorm Titan in my core 62 cards. You can add it with the flex slots, but in my version, which I will show you later, at the end of this, I will show you my current version of 75, and you'll see that there is no Sandstorm Titan in that deck. Okay. Katra the Devoted. This is the single best payoff card for Life Force in the game, I believe, and this is really why you even bother play Life Force. This is the card that is going to allow you to do degenerate things later on in the game. And without the power of this card, I don't think Life Force decks would exist. In the previous version of this deck, this card used to die instantly every single time I cast this. And that is because in the past, there are no other units worth killing before the 4-drop slot. But with the new, with this new version of the deck and the inclusion of the 2 new cards, there is a much higher chance that Katra will survive and do what you put it into the deck to do. Okay. The Beckoning Lumen, I think this is a very powerful card in Life Force deck. It's one of the few cards that provides you with card advantage. There really isn't a lot of card advantage in Xenan decks like this. On top of the Life Force trigger, it is a sizable offensive threat. It can block very well and trade with most units in the game. And your opponent do need to answer it very quickly, or he'll get smacked for 6 per turn and die very quickly, or you will bury him in card advantage very quickly, especially when you have repeatable life gain in your deck. Not sure you need 4 copies. I think 3 may be okay, 2 may be okay as well. So the number of the Beckoning Lumen is something that is, I think, flexible. Slimespitter Slug, another one of my favorite cards. One of the biggest weakness to this deck, as you can see, is that there are actually very little flying cards other than just removal. Sandstorm Titan works very well for anti-flying, but I think in this specific deck, the Slug is even better. First of all, the Slug actually kills the unit. The Slug itself grows, and it turns every removal spell you have in your deck into a Life Force trigger while it's in play. And it's very aggressive at 6 power. So for those reasons, I've chosen this over the Iconic Titan. And finally, I have a one-off for Hall of the Lost Kings. You will find that against a lot of mid-range and late-game decks, and even against some of the aggro decks, it's very feasible to hit 7 power with more than 25 life. And this card sort of just instantly wins you the game. Even against the very popular and very powerful Argent Port decks, they don't run Harsh Rule. They usually play their threats 1 turn at a time. One threat per turn. And there are many games where my opponent will have these gigantic 10-13 Tavarad Auric Brokers, drawing himself 2 extra card a turn, but it doesn't even matter when I play 5/5/5s in 1 turn, and then I attack in for the kill the following turn. Many decks cannot handle 5/5/5s, all coming at them at the same time. So, here is the core of the deck. Now, I have built a second core, and it's a slightly different direction to take the deck, and some of you may have seen this deck before on the ladder. Instead of using Slimespitter, Slug, and the Beckoning Lumen for card advantage, it aims to use the new Auric Interrogator as a card advantage engine, and to make sure it hits 5 power, rather than using weapons, it uses cards like Xenan Initiation and Dark Return, which will give it +1/+1 and make it big enough, and also cards like Xenan Obelisk, which will then also passively grow your 1/1 cantrips like Temple Scribe, Acolytes, and Sanctuary Priest, turning them into sizable threats when you hit 8 power. And it also forgoes the Slimespitter Slug for the much more aggressive Impending Doom. This deck is much more powerful, I would say, in terms of brute force, but it does require a lot more slots. As you can see, just these cards here is taking up 71 cards, giving you only a flexible slot of 4. And right here, you haven't even included any removal spells, so I would suspect that you would be just adding 4 removal spells to the rest of this to make the 75 card deck. And you can also see that the curve is quite high, topping out at 4 as the peak of your curve. And this is a very unhealthy curve, by the way. So personally, I stayed away from this version. So here's my version of the deck. I've chosen to use no Amber Acolytes and stuck with 3 Seek Power because I wanted to reduce my curve. I thought the curve was a little too high. I used Blister Sting Wasps on my 2 slot because, once again, I wanted my curve to be lower so that I can survive against early game decks and also have a way to fight opposing mid-range decks that just cast very large units. I'm a big fan of Deadly as a mechanic. I think there are too many large vanilla bruisers out there that you would love to block with a Deadly Wasp. For example, Tavarad is a perfect example. I just said example twice, didn't I? Tavarad is a perfect example. You can block it with a Blistering Wasp. You can block Sandstorm Titans. You can block Heart of the Vault. You can block basically anything that doesn't have Quick Strike, which makes this a very good inclusion to the deck and really ensures that my deck, that I survive long enough for the mid and late game plans to come to fruition. I have chosen to use 4 copies of Ayan because right now where I am fighting in Diamond 3 and also all of Gold, there are a lot of aggressive decks. Lots of Arcano right now, lots of Skycrag, and tons of Argent Port, and plenty of Skycrag. And having the Ayan is very good against those decks, and the vast majority of the time this will trade for a Torch. It'll block something, it gain me maybe a couple of life. That's good enough. It's very rare to ultimate the Ayan. I've fill up the rest of the deck with basically removal spells. 2 copies of Annihilate. The Wasp is sort of a removal spell. I added 4 copies of Banish and 2 copies of Death Strike. The 4 Banish because Chalice is one of the most popular decks at the moment, along with Argenport and Armory. And Banish is good against all 3 of those decks. So I think this is a very good meta call right now. And besides that, everything else is the core. And of course, the mana base looks like this. I'm not sure how many copies of Diplomatic Suit I should run. 2 seems to be okay. And 4 Amber Monument is sort of a must-have if you're playing time, because it is a very good way to prevent mana flooding and mana screw at the same time. So this is my current version of the deck. It's working out pretty decently. My win rate is not fantastic, but I'm continuing to tweak this deck, and I'm fairly happy with this version right now. So I'm going to record the gameplay videos separately because this video is getting a little too long. As always, thank you so much for watching my videos. If you like what you see, give me a like and or a thumbs up depending on where you found the video. And if you want to see more content from me, please click the subscribe button. I do have a couple more interesting decks to showcase, and I am also working on and fine-tuning the new Armory deck because I think it is one of the best decks out there right now, and I think, objectively speaking, in my personal opinion, I think Armory is the best deck right now. So I would definitely showcase some videos of that later on as well. But as always, thank you very much for watching.